Every single person has their own parameters, has what they're trying to achieve in their life. They have what's important for them and their family and their future. And based on those parameters, it'll help you make the right decisions for you and your family.
But that whole saying, "If fair van jou goed, na in jou skade," if it's a long way away from your heart, you're going to lose it. But to be honest, those days are gone. That's 20th century. If you're not thinking globally, if you're not chasing the globe for the best returns, you're in the 20th century. It's very simple.
But with regards to international investment, you said this morning that it's vital to have someone on the ground, otherwise you're pretty much destined for failure. If you're investing internationally.
I didn't say pretty much, I said destined.
And considering the rand has lost 26% from the 1st of January, and it's actually more now, considering what's happened in the last couple of days, I'm sorry, but the blatant truth is, if you've got all your assets in rand, you're 26% poorer.
It does come down to the numbers. If you live in Joburg, I would say get your first investment property in Joburg. Probably get your second one there. You've got to cut your teeth on it. You've got to learn the ropes. You've got to learn what it takes to be a good investor.
One of the most important keys to success, owning a lot of companies, it's about hedging and diversifying, and that's what it's about.
Clem Sunter, if anyone's been to any of his talks, has 4 different scenarios for the global economy. Then he has 3 different scenarios for the South African economy, which encompasses Africa as well.
The economies are different, the customers are different, the people are different, and you can't possibly understand what's going on in a different culture if you're not there on a regular basis. So the ones that are there on a regular basis, if you trust them and you partner with them, you're going to be all right.
Yeah, which is precisely Chantal Aubry's point, which is that scenario planning is just daydreaming. You've got to connect the dots. You've got to have the flags, have the probabilities, look at the best strategy for each scenario, and then come out with a balanced picture.
Could you maybe give us some more insight on where people should be looking? I believe you've just written a book on this with Clem Sunter. So share your insights on that.
Look, what we did is we built a 4-dimensional model where we took his theory and we gave people a system, a formula called the GPS system, the Global Property System.
You can use Clem's scenarios, you can use the kind of the understanding, and then you can rate your factors in terms of risk, pros and cons, and you can ultimately decide, where the better places are to invest.
But if you've got 10 properties in Joburg and you're looking at buying an 11th, I for one would say don't buy it in Joburg. Buy it in Cape Town, go to Port Elizabeth, go to Durban, go to anywhere else. And once you've got a few more, I would even say it's time to think about going global.
As a result of the scenarios, and I have to congratulate you. I think this graph does exactly that.
I just love entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. And I'm here with Scott Picken, who's one of the top property experts, offshore property experts in all of South Africa.
I was skeptical. I sat down with him and his partners. I'm a true believer. His book is phenomenal.
He's even written the book. When I say someone's written the book, I usually mean they're good at it. But he's literally written the book on going global.
Because there's so many factors to take into account. There's the variables of which country has the best value in terms of price probability. Where are you getting the best yields? Where is the rule of law the best?
So you got to talk to them. You got to sit down with them. Not talking to would do a disservice to you and your business.
Property Going Global. Systematic and scientific formulas. 2013, we got returns of 41.41%, a minimum for all our investors. That is why this book is the authority on international property investment.
Well, hello, and welcome to everyone. That video from 10 years ago is slightly embarrassing to watch, I'm not going to lie. So you watch it 10 years later, and it's quite embarrassing. But Clem, it's with a huge amount of respect and gratitude. It's wonderful to have you live, and 10 years later to be reviewing what we were discussing 10 years ago.
Absolutely, Scott. And shall I start, or do you want to say anything?
What I'd like to do, Clem, let me just give a quick intro in terms of just getting everyone in the room, and then we'll crack straight into it, because everyone's come to hear from you and not from me. So let's be very clear on that. I want to just share the screen here quickly, and then we'll dive right into it quickly for you. So let's rock and roll here. So what are we looking at? Basically, the update and the new way to invest, and ultimately how you can reduce your risk and increase your risk return ratio by a factor of 5. I tend to joke with people, and it's important to kind of put yourself in this situation, but where were you 11 years ago? 11 years ago, it was 2012. I traveled all over America. I went from the West Coast to the East Coast. We went to all the major cities. We did 8 cities in 9 days. And I won't bore you with all the pictures and the stories, but there was a phenomenal opportunity that we found on the ground in America. And I went with Brendan Brown and Neil Peterson. And, we came back to South Africa, and along with the Real Estate Investor magazine, we literally a month later did events, and we taught people, we showed them what was happening, and it was fascinating. At the time, the Rand was R8.52 to the dollar. And, when I did this presentation last week, it was 1980 in terms of the process. Then I asked people, what were you doing 10 years ago? And if you take that year, it was the year that Nelson Mandela passed away, Snowden and the whole WikiLeaks came out. And even for those of you parents, you probably remember Frozen. And if you take the stock market and what was happening financially, there was a huge amount. It was the best performing year since 1997. The NASDAQ surged 38%. Twitter had a very successful IPO. Bitcoin was at $13, believe it or not. There's generally a strong recovery all around the world in terms of what happened. But just to put in context of how long ago 10 years was for you, you weren't using Uber. You didn't even know what Uber was because although it had been invented, it hadn't left America yet. You probably hadn't heard of Airbnb and weren't using Airbnb. And you probably hadn't thought of going in a car with some other stranger or letting a stranger stay in your house or you staying in someone else's house. And you probably hadn't heard of crowdfunding either. And yet all of those 3 massive trends all changed around that time 10 years ago. And I was super, super grateful. Clem was very, very kind to me in helping me with, this book that we actually, that I launched back 10 years ago. And really it was trying to take all his scenario planning and everything that he teaches, which is, highly recognized around the world, and help people make decisions that they could, make better decisions from an investment perspective. When I look at 10 years later, I wrote that book with the intention of it being evergreen. It was a terrible experience. Clem, I don't know how you've written 17 or 18 books. I never want to write another book in my life, but I've learned a lot, and in the last 10 years, in 2014, I started investing in commercial property. In 2019, I started investing in other alternative assets. And I fundamentally believe that people now are looking for globally diversified passive income. And if they are, they need to be diversifying across countries, currencies, assets, partners, and time. And just keep that in the back of the mind based on where we're going to go now with scenarios. So, whether you think it's America, England, Europe, Australia, South Africa, or anywhere else on the planet, that's why we're here today, to learn about where the world is going, what are the scenarios, and what do you need to know. And I fundamentally believe it comes down to 2 simple things. It's about having the right information and the right partners. And that's why I deeply appreciate Clem coming with us today to share the information from his perspective. Just to give you a little bit of context, most people I'm sure know exactly who Clem is, but he's effectively an internationally acclaimed author on management strategy, scenario planning, corporate social responsibility. He's the former CEO and chairman of the gold and uranium division of Anglo American. He's widely renowned as one of the leading scenario planners. He's the author of 17 books on leadership, crisis management, planning, and strategy. 2 of the books that you probably will know, most people know, The Mind of the Fox, and then the latest book, which I really enjoyed and highly recommend, which was Thinking the Future, which is really, really good perspectives. And then he's lectured at Harvard Business School in Boston and at the Central Party School in Beijing, and recently was, well, probably not so recently anymore, but honorary doctorate at the University of Cape Town in terms of that process. So without further ado, I want to jump in to, 10 years ago in the book, chapters 4 and 5, these were the scenarios 10 years ago. I always use the flag system, or, if you're from South Africa, you'll know that if you go swimming with a white flag, it basically means that there's a shark in the water, so it's probably not a good way to do it. And so the way I think about it when I first heard Clem talk is he's going to give you different scenarios. No one has a crystal ball on where the world is going. Then there's flags, should I go swimming or shouldn't I go swimming, which will probably, impact your life. And then there's a probability, which you need to take into account. And 10 years ago, I took that and I said, well, based on those scenarios, where should I be investing? What should I be investing in? Came up with some different strategies and models, etc. But the important thing today is that we haven't come here to hear from me. And, whether you're looking at the global scenarios or the South African scenarios, we've come here to listen to Clem. And when Clem finishes, I want to share with you how we've launched the digital upgrade. in terms of wealth going global. So not just property going global, but wealth going global. And I also want to share with you a masterclass that we're running next week on diversification and what you can learn from some of the wealthiest people that I've witnessed over the last 24 years. But without further ado, Clem, I wanted to pivot to you because you are the man of the moment and we've all come to learn and listen. I'm going to put up these 6 odd questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the screen off so that we can see and hear you loud and clear. And the idea of today, as I understand it, is we're going to kind of run through what is scenario planning, just so people understand it as a methodology. What are the current scenarios for the global economy? What are the flags we need to look out for? What are the probabilities? Then, you know, we've got a global audience, so please let us know where you're coming from in the world. But, you know, obviously a strong contingent from South Africa as well. And most of us South Africans kind of at least want to know where our future is. And then finally, you know, what do you think some of the opportunities and risks would be? So without further ado, I am going to shut up, stop sharing, and hand over to the man who actually has all the information. So welcome, Clem.
So much, Scott, and what a pleasure to participate in today's seminar. I'm going to do 3 things. I want to talk about the model that one should use to look at the future. Then I'd like to talk about the global flags and scenarios, and then South Africa. I'll start with the book that Scott showed on the screen, Thinking the Future. It was published in 2021 by Penguin. And yeah, it's been top of the business planning and forecasting chart on Amazon for a long time. It was certainly in the top 5 in that first year. And it really shows how one should look at the future based on the philosophers, the ancient philosophers of the past. And in the first chapter, I contrast Plato with Aristotle. Plato believed that as a true philosopher, you should go outside into the sunlight, sit in the chair, and then think of the ideal form for the world. He felt there was this one true idea about the way the whole world worked. And in total contrast, Aristotle was much more of a scientist. Aristotle was his student, and he said, no, that's not the way to do it. You've got to look around for all the evidence, and as new evidence comes in, you must change your ideas about the world. He had a much more flexible approach. And it leads me on to the other philosopher we showcase in the book, Socrates, who basically said life is about asking the right questions. If you want to get the right answers, you've got to ask the right questions, and you must not be afraid to question anything. In fact, he died for his beliefs. He was made to drink hemlock by an Athenian court because he was questioning the whole state of Athens. And yeah, one of the most important things to do is constantly question your assumptions about the future. And a much more modern philosopher that we include in the book is Isaiah Berlin, who in the 1960s wrote a book called The Hedgehog and the Fox. He was actually a philosophy tutor at Oxford when I was there. And he was quoting from an ancient Greek poet called Archilochus, who had the following lines: the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And if you think about it, Plato was the ultimate hedgehog, looking for that one big thing, whereas Aristotle was much more of a fox because he was always looking around. Foxes have very alert eyes and they can capture changes in the environment around them. And then they're very agile in terms of responding to those changes. And we feel very, very strongly that you've got to be more like a fox than a hedgehog when you look at the future. And indeed, as Scott said, we produced this book called The Mind of a Fox in 2001. But to get back to methodology, in order to write a set of scenarios, you've got to look at the flags that are changing the present into the future? What are the forces really driving the present, which will mean that in 5 to 10 years' time, the present will look very different? That is the basic question you've got to ask yourself. And as a futurist, it's absolutely vital that every day you say, are there new flags going up? And what is happening to the flags that I've already identified? That is the whole point of being a futurist. You then can construct different storylines about the future based on the flags. And then as those flags go up and down the mast, you apply different probabilities to the scenarios. Intuitive probabilities, not, according to some strict mathematical formula. You apply intuitive probabilities. And it's very good to have a conversation with friends in order to determine those particular probabilities. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of flags and scenarios that flowed out of them. The first one was in 1988, when I had a conversation with a member of the Anglo scenario team. The company I worked for had this scenario team with some experts, and one of them was Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman who headed up scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell. And in the mid to late 80s, he was regarded as probably the world's greatest scenario planner. And he said in 1988, he said, you're going to be surprised by what I'm going to say to you, Clem. But, we all think Japan is the sort of greatest economy in the world. It's grown at 7 to 8% per annum. But he says, if ever there is a property crash, Japan will never grow at that rate again. So I said to him, why do you say that, Pierre? And he said, because the flag is the aging of the Japanese population. It's the oldest country on earth in terms of percentage of people over 65. And at the time, Japanese property was spellbinding. I mean, the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was worth more than the entire state of California. And of course, we did actually have a property crash in 1990 in Japan. But Pierre had a flag that went up just before the crash happened. He said, golf club membership in Tokyo is declining. And that means that the rich elite in Tokyo who've been introduced to golf are not feeling so well off as they did some time ago. And I feel that this is a flag that could change the property market. And boom, the property market crashed. The stock market crashed. In fact, it's never reached the level that it was in 1990. And Japan has never grown very fast. In fact, sort of somewhere around about 0.5% per annum economic growth since then. But that was so sharp of Pierre to come up with the flag of the aging of the population in Japan. And then secondly, a closer flag, which was the sort of decline in golf club membership in Tokyo. The second example is from the book, which I wrote with a young woman called Chantal Ilbery, and it was called The Mind of a Fox, and we published it in June 2001. And in the book, we had a letter to George Bush. We didn't send it to him, but we did publish it in the book. And in it, we said that if he wanted to leave a legacy as US president, he would have to think like a fox about the future. And we said that his biggest threat at the time was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And of course, it happened 3 months after we published the book with 9/11. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a direct letter to the president said, this is your biggest threat. How do I know this? Because the US State Department rang me up about 6 months after 9/11 to say, how on earth could 2 South Africans come up with a scenario which no American intelligence agency had done? And I said, it's because we had 3 flags which we were playing prior to 9/11. The first was the growing competition between the major religions of the world, which really began in the late 1980s and intensified in the 90s between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements around the world in terms of what they were capable of inflicting in terms of damage to human life and property. But the flag that convinced us that something might happen in the West was the two attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in maybe an American or a city elsewhere in the West. And that's why this technique is so good. It's not that we could have possibly said 3 months after we've written the book, it's going to happen in New York, it's going to be planes flying into buildings. You have to have inside knowledge for that kind of detail. As Pierre used to say, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. But when you've identified a flag, it's most important to be sensitive to the other flags, like the golf club flag in Turkey. And interestingly, there was a congressional inquiry into 9/11 after the event. And there was a young woman in the FBI who testified to this inquiry and said, I went to my boss on 6 occasions and said, boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off, but not land. And he refused to investigate it. Well, if the boss had actually been conscious of our broader flag that an attack had become more likely, he might have then investigated that attack. And in fact, the two potential pilots being educated at the school were part of the team of 19 that inflicted the damage and everything else on 9/11. So it shows just how important this technique is at identifying the flags in advance and then playing different scenarios. And I'd like to go through the global flags, which Scott was talking about going back, to 2012, 2013. I'm going back to around about 2014, 2015, when many of these flags were identified by myself and the people that I was working with. And I actually wrote a book in 2015 called Flag Watching, which contains many of these flags. And the first one I'd like to talk about is one which was in a more recent article. I wrote it about 6 months ago, called the leadership flag. I've come to the conclusion that one of the most important things for all of us is something which is entirely beyond our control, which is who are the leaders at the time we're alive? I mean, when my father was alive and working in London in the 1930s, there was this guy called Adolf Hitler in Germany rising up in power. And it changed my father's life because he had to stop working in 1939, join the army. He fought in the war till 1945, and then he went back to work again. But, there was a guy on a totally different continent who completely changed his life. And it can also be done in a positive way. In the late 80s, you had Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev. And they happened to be the world leaders at the time, and they came together. They rather liked each other. They had a very positive relationship. And guess what? The Cold War ended, and the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1990, and the Berlin Wall came down. And all that happened because you actually had 3 leaders who got on with one another at the time. Unfortunately, the flag at the moment is pretty dismal. We have 3 elderly world leaders who simply don't get along with one another. We all know about Vladimir Putin, and I'll come back to him in the second flag, and Russia. But you've got Joe Biden, who's 80 years old, and if he actually stands for re-election, he'll be elected when he's 82, and he'll be 86 when he retires. That's even old for a retirement village. And yeah, you know, he's quite a hedgehog because he believes the whole thing around the world is about democracy versus autocracy. There's no sort of, you know, compromise or anything around that particular factor. And then the third person is you've got a Xi, who is very different to Deng Xiaoping, who was the person who really revolutionized the Chinese economy in the 80s. Xi is more like an old-fashioned Mao in terms of wanting to reestablish the central authority of the Chinese Communist Party on China. And so, yeah, at the moment, we don't have the kind of world leadership that we need to resolve the problems. And we're going to have to wait for the next generation of leaders to come through and hope that they're better. And equally, hope that another country like India aspires to world leadership so that their leader can join the trio that we have at the moment. So it is an important flag to watch in terms of the future of the global economy. Which brings me on to the second flag, which I did have in the book in 2015. It's the red flag of Russia, China, and North Korea, the three ex-communist countries, and what their relationship might be with America. This was after Russia had just annexed Ukraine and started moving some troops into the eastern areas of Ukraine. I mean, a lot of people don't know there's been a kind of ongoing war since 2015, before the actual Russian invasion last year. There has been a war, and I actually wrote 10 pages on the kind of Ukrainian flag and how it could actually develop into a third world war between Russia and America, with all the downside of the use of nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction. It's not that I put a big probability on that scenario, but it's the whole purpose of the work that we do, that you look at the upside scenarios for opportunity and the downside scenarios for risk. And yeah, there is certainly the risk at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen next in this war. The Ukrainians have mounted a counter-offensive. If they're successful, what will Russia do next? They're moving tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. Apparently, according to the president of Belarus, they're 3 times as powerful as the atomic bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I didn't know that tactical nuclear weapons were as powerful as that. But you know, it just shows what is at stake in this particular war. And what really surprises me is that you don't have any of the mainstream media in the world with clever journalists actually going into the kind of different scenarios that could, you know, flow out of this particular war. And of course, one is that Europe is going to remain an incredibly vulnerable place. I mean, think about it. After 1990, there was talk of Russia actually joining the European Union. That talk has completely gone away. And of course, there's a huge animosity now between Russia and all the NATO countries. And that's not going to disappear fast, whatever happens in terms of the war. So you've got to just watch that particular flag all the time. America is further away from the war, and obviously if there is a third world war, it will get involved. But at the moment, the American economy isn't being nearly as much affected as all the economies of Europe. The second country is China. And of course, the difference now is that China is the second largest economy in the world. It is a rival to the United States. And of course, there's this whole issue of Taiwan. Everybody accepted that it was an ambiguous status, Taiwan, until recently. And suddenly now you've got American warships going up the straits between Taiwan and China, which are very narrow. And then Chinese naval ships going in front of the American ships, very close at hand. So again, it's a situation that you have to watch. And particularly in terms of globalization, that was one of the great things of the last century, when, goods were manufactured where they could be manufactured, and a lot of manufacturers moved to China. Now, are we going to get back into a situation where more and more sanctions and tariffs and all kinds of stuff come into play? So we almost go back to the 1930s, where everybody moves back to their own economies. So that's why this Chinese flag has to be watched. And of course, people also play a third world war between America and China as a possibility, because they are such different countries. And then the third country, which is enormously uncertain, but you have to watch all the time, is North Korea. I mean, when Trump shook hands with the North Korean leader in the DMZ between North Korea and South Korea, everybody thought, gosh, maybe he's going to achieve something. They're going to denuclearize and get rid of some of their nuclear weapons, but they never did. The only thing they stopped at the time was ballistic missile testing, but now they're back to doing that. They fly missiles over Japan, which makes Japan very fearful. And so you've got to constantly watch what is next going to happen in North Korea. Which brings me to the third flag, which is Pierre's flag. It's the gray flag of the aging of the world's population. It's not talked about much by financial analysts, but it has a huge impact on where you should invest. And it is interesting, the two places that have followed Japan in terms of growing old is Europe. In fact, Greece and Italy both have very old populations, and I think the Italian population is actually declining. And Britain is also aging, and their economies are simply going to slow down as a result. And of course, you're going to have crises like national health in the UK as the population gets older. America is a younger, more resilient population, and therefore will naturally grow faster economically than Europe or Japan. But there's one other country which has recently been affected by that flag, and that's China. China, last year, their population diminished by 1 million. Now, that in terms of 1.4 billion people, 1 million is neither here nor there, but it is a significant flag that the Chinese population, because of the one-child policy that they had for a long time, is now very middle-aged and is about to get elderly. And yeah, you simply don't have that sort of growth of young people coming through. And that's why the Chinese economy is slowing down. And in fact, I saw the figure today that youth unemployment, despite the fact that there isn't that quantity of young people, is standing at 20%. The Chinese economy is slowing down. And you've got to feed that into your calculations on the future of the world. So the gray flag is very important. Africa, India, South America are still young countries. In fact, I'm beginning to think that India might actually overtake both America and China to become the world's largest economy in the second half of the century. Which brings me on to the most existential flag in terms of the threats to the world, which is the green flag. It's not the one which is associated with sharks and allow you to swim. This is the flag about the environment and climate change. And when I talk to all the environmentalists that persuaded me to have this as a flag way back at the beginning of this century, they all say they were wrong in one respect. They all thought that climate change would happen seriously in the second half of the century, whereas it is happening right now in front of our eyes. I think of the wildfires in Canada, which are now, raging and causing air pollution in New York and elsewhere. We have Spain, huge drought in the middle of Spain. I mean, there is no rain in Spain at the moment. But then New Zealand on the north coast of the South Island has had torrential downpours to the extent that insurance companies will no longer insure houses in particular areas because of flooding. And the same goes for California. Insurance companies are now picking up where, you know, it is not good to cover possessions and houses because of the incredible changes in the climate. I mean, people talk about atmospheric rivers. That's the word that's now used in California for some of the rainfall systems that come in. And then the poor old polar bears are on shrinking ice in the Arctic. In fact, somebody said there will be a moment in the Arctic in the near future when there won't be ice. And, you know, that's a terrible thing for the world. And of course, it will raise sea levels. Which brings me on to the next flag that has been on our list since 2015, which is the anti-establishment flag. Because what happened in the financial crash of 2007, 2008 was that, you know, everybody suffered in that crash. But then the markets recovered, as Scott showed. You know, there were quite a few years since then when the markets have done well. And so the super rich have got back to being super rich. But the middle class and working class people are actually no better off than they were in 2007. In fact, somebody showed me the figures for a nurse in the NHS in the UK, and their salary increases have been such that a nurse is worse off now in real terms than in 2007. And this has created a lot of fury amongst a huge number of people who are right now going through a sort of cost of living crisis and having to juggle with their expenditure. And that has then obviously fed into the political equation. And, you know, you have more populist leaders and you have many more dramatic things going on. I mean, I don't think that you will have ever come across the kind of warfare now between Republicans and Democrats in the United States. And of course, all this is exaggerated by social media and maybe in the future by artificial intelligence. It's terrible. We're moving into a more polarized world because of this feeling, you know, of that it's the establishment's at fault. And of course, it's partially at fault because of the rising inequality in the world. And that brings me to a flag which was raised by Interpol. In 2012, I facilitated a session in Paris with all the top police chiefs around the world on what were the biggest threats to the world over the next 10 years. And they said the number one threat was porous borders. It would be people pouring into rich countries from poor countries, and there being very little way to stop them. And that is exactly what's going on now in the Mediterranean. In fact, there was a dreadful tragedy yesterday when more people were drowned in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's certainly happening in the Channel. It's happening between the border of Mexico and the US. And I can promise you, if that green flag of climate change gets really rough, you're not going to have hundreds of thousands of people trying to get into the West. You're going to have millions upon millions of people coming across those borders. So again, it's a flag that you have to watch. The national debt flag, well, you know, I remember in flag watching in 2015, I said, because of all the cheap money that we've had from 2007, you've got to watch that moment when interest rates start to rise again, because that will make government debt that much more expensive. And of course, since 2015, we've had easy money, which got even easier during the pandemic. And yeah, interest rates are now rising. I see that the Fed has paused its interest rate rises at around 5%. In Britain, they could still rise further interest rates. And as we know, as soon as you have rising interest rates, it becomes more difficult to service government debt, service mortgages, and yeah, it can create some fairly rough conditions. So national debt and interest rates is a flag that must continually be watched. Pandemic, well, that was a flag, and I've included it ever since the mid-80s when we first did scenario planning. The idea that a pandemic could change the world was on our radar screen. Again, you could never tell when it was going to happen, but we absolutely had it with COVID-19. It shut down the world economy, and it showed what a nasty virus can do. And obviously that is now past, but we must keep that flag on our radar screen in case there's another thing like avian flu or something else which comes along. And as I said, the whole point about a general flag is then to pick up the very specific flag that we're into, another situation, rather like, quite a few people picked up on the Wuhan experience, particularly around the lab, very early on, and said this could turn into a major pandemic. And the last two flags I've added recently: crowded space, the fact that our space now is incredibly crowded with objects, satellites and rockets and this and that. There was a very close miss between a Chinese satellite and an American private space rocket the other day. And there are no laws of space. I mean, there's just one, which was the United Nations in 1967 saying, space is owned by everybody. And so, yeah, obviously, if there is a collision in space, it will spread fragments everywhere and possibly interfere with the international banking system and obviously with communications. So, yeah, maybe there's going to be far more legislation on space. And the last one is the most recent flag that I've added, which is obviously artificial intelligence, or as the guy who invented Chat GPT said, it's artificial general intelligence, and where that's going to go. And yeah, it's a very interesting kind of scenarios that Sam Altman has outlined on AI. Obviously, there's a lot of good that can be done in terms of making people much more productive, but equally one has to watch out for all the nefarious ways that artificial intelligence can be used. And what I say is now is I play the two scenarios that we played in the letter to George Bush, Chantal and I. We had Friendly Planet and we had Gilded Cage. Because the Gilded Cage scenario, for me, is the one we're in at the moment. It's where the G7, NATO are putting up a cage around themselves in order to protect themselves from the illegal migrants, from obviously the threat of what Russia is doing in Crimea. And yeah, it's not a good world because it cuts right across this thing of trying to spread technology, get everybody to trade with one another. Yeah, it's not a good scenario from a world economic point of view. But the alternative scenario we gave to Bush was Friendly Planet. It's where you do have a set of global leaders who, like they did in the late 1980s, they construct a much more cooperative world. And that scenario has not gone away, but it will require new leaders. And we're just going to have to wait and see. the kind of people who come through, and what they do. It's at the moment, I'm afraid to say, I give a fairly high probability to the gilded cage scenario, but obviously I'm watching the flags, particularly around leadership, to see if I can increase the probability of the friendly planet. And as Scott quite rightly said, you've got to pick the countries which actually are pretty resilient and will survive the gilded cage scenario, and equally you've got to consider which are the countries that might lose most through that particular scenario. As far as South Africa is concerned, what are the flags that people have raised? Well, the first one obviously is crime and corruption, which has been around for a long time, and Cyril has said that he'll do something about it here. There's definitely much more stuff going on, and there is more transparency, but there's a long way to go on that particular flag. The second is the quality of infrastructure in this country, with the load shedding that we've had with Eskom, the poor railway system that we have. But, I think the new electricity minister has made a difference. We've actually gone quite a few days without any load shedding at all, which is obviously a positive flag. And we're just going to have to wait and see. I remember when I did a session with the Central Party School in Beijing. That's the kind of inner heart of the Chinese Communist Party. And they wanted to understand how scenario planning could be used for their 5-year planning process, which they have at the school. And they showed me around the school afterwards, and they'd taken down all slogans of Mao Zedong, replaced them with slogans of Deng Xiaoping. And I said to one of the professors, why? He said, because Deng taught us two things when he came in 1978. He said, we've got to concentrate on improving the quality of infrastructure, of the roads, the bridges, the airports, the power systems in China. And the second thing we've got to do is allow ordinary Chinese citizens to create wealth for themselves. And this professor said that's what made us go from the 100th ranked economy in 1988 to 78 to where we are today in 2006 as number 5. And of course, they're number 2 now. So quality of infrastructure really does count as a flag and has to be watched. And so I'll be looking to see what the National Health Insurance Bill in South Africa, which has just passed through Parliament, can do in terms of improving or not improving the quality of healthcare in this country. The third flag is the 2024 election. A lot of people have said in the past that it could be the watershed election. I'm beginning to think that it is, because a lot of young people have lost faith in the ruling party, but they would feel disloyal in terms of voting for other parties. So this is a golden opportunity for the DA and for the other smaller parties to market themselves to young people in this country and say, this is what we will do if we become the government of this country in terms of improving education and improving the opportunities for you to work in South Africa, given the incredibly high youth unemployment rate that we have here. The next flag is, for me, the most positive flag. It's around entrepreneurship. I've always said that the nature of work has changed. In the last century, the mining industry in South Africa employed hundreds of thousands of people. But those days have gone, because you've got robotics, you've got now artificial intelligence. There's so many things that have replaced people. So the only way that you have a low unemployment rate is to have an incredibly vibrant small business sector. It's why America stands out from Europe and has an unemployment rate below 4%. Basically, Americans are more entrepreneurial. And if you think about why they are the #1 economy in the world, it's not because of their politicians like Abe Lincoln and George Washington and all those people. It's because of their entrepreneurs, people like Henry Ford, Walt Disney, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, who was actually his father was Syrian. His mother was American, and he was brought up by the Jobs family. He's probably changed life for more people in the world than anybody else has done in the last 20 years. But that's America. That's why entrepreneurship is so important. And I want Cyril Ramaphosa here to make it his #1 concern. He should actually have a panel of entrepreneurs like he did during the pandemic, with a panel of doctors to advise him on the best moves to integrate the township economies with the mainstream economy. I mean, we should have, I think, in every city in South Africa, an e-stock exchange, so that you could, as a small business, put your business on that site and then use crowdfunding to expand that business. I certainly believe that banks should get together to produce a micro lending facility, because at the moment the costs of micro lending are too high for them to take it seriously, but we've got to take it seriously. And yeah, all in all, big business, I feel, should designate 20% of its supply chain to nurturing small business. We've done that in Anglo around our mines since the mid-90s. Every big business in this country should be doing that. It is the most important thing we can do for a positive scenario. I remember doing a debate with Julius Malema in 2016, where I said, I'm as much of a economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. Yours is about taking over the land and the mines and that. Mine is all about helping young people become entrepreneurs and achieving real economic freedom. And the last flag, which has just popped up, and it's related to the red flag of Russia, is the neutrality flag. You have to keep a sense of neutrality because, you know, this is a very tricky world. And that incident that happened with the Lady R, and, you know, people are now investigating whether weapons were actually loaded on this particular Russian vessel in Simonstown, because as Scott said, the rand just went poof as a result of it. So it is a very, very important flag to watch, the neutrality flag. Which brings me to the two scenarios: people's economy, where we put entrepreneurship as our #1 issue to create a real open, inclusive economy, and really put the private sector and the public sector behind achieving that. And the alternative is cautionary tale, where we go into a vortex of anarchy and gradually descend into a wasteland. And right now, given the incredible resilience of business in South Africa and how they got through the pandemic, and even now with load shedding, how people have adjusted, and how ordinary South Africans work together. So there's no question of, you know, being black, white, colored, Asian. Everybody works together in a non-racial team. And I always say, you know, we went from white rugby to a non-racial world-class rugby team. We've won the World Cup. It can be done, but you've got to have the support system to do that. And so I actually give at least a 50% probability to the people's economy scenario at the moment, unlike many of my colleagues who've gone very negative. I'm still quite hopeful because of the resilience on the ground in South Africa. So I hope I've given you a good model to use. I hope I've given you some of the flags to watch in the global situation. I've told you about South Africa, and I'd like to end with a benediction for all of you who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Clem. I deeply appreciate it. Tell me, just in my interest, I don't know if you've got it off the top of your head, what would you've got 50-50 probability for people's economy and cautionary tale. What would be your Gilded Cage Friendly Planet? Is it also 50-50, or you said high probability, lower probability?
Yeah, I would say 40 at the moment, given the current global leadership. I'm 40% on Friendly Planet and 60 on Gilded Cage, because the current leadership, maybe you never know, human beings can change, but I just don't see these three old guys changing their mind. And actually, that relationship is absolutely crucial to creating a more favorable political and economic scenario for the world. And so, what I do is now study the successors, the potential successors to each of these leaders, and also how other leaders could become influential in terms of global affairs.
Just talk to that one. I know we're going to go into a proper Q&A, but let's just on that one around India specifically, because I'm fascinated by what you said. And, I've believed for a couple of years now. I was in India in 2018 and I got really excited by China in 2015, but I even got more excited by India when I was there in 2018, 2019. And you've spoken quite a lot about India, and I don't know, my hunch tells me that India backing, and I'm not sort of, I'm talking personally rather than what you said about them possibly taking over America and China in the second half of this century. But it just feels to me like India has significant potential at the moment in terms of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the one thing which previous Indian rulers did not do, which Deng did, was put the infrastructure first. So there's still a lot of work to be done with the quality of infrastructure in terms of roads, communication systems, and all that, education, healthcare in India. But there's no doubt that there's been an incredible entrepreneurial spirit in India, for forever. And I just feel that we're now beginning to see that flow through. And of course, they are a democracy. They've got no problem in terms of trading with the rest of the world. So I've kind of changed my opinion now between China and India. China's definitely suffering from the gray flag of an aging population. And India may well, continue to grow at sort of 8 to 10% per annum because of the entrepreneurs coming through on a better infrastructure.
It's interesting what you say. The other thing that I found fascinating, even from the people I know there personally, is how proud they're becoming to be Indian. I don't know if that makes sense, and there's almost in some way a negative way as well. There's populace, like we won't be told anymore by the West what will or won't be happening, and they're sort of finding their own identity is what I suppose I'm saying.
Yeah, they are. Absolutely, they're finding their own identity. And it's one of the reasons I wrote an article very recently that it is a true privilege to be part of BRICS. I know that Russia is part of BRICS, and it's had this kind of downside with the whole questioning of our neutrality over that ship, which I talked about. But being in the same, equivalent to G7 as India and China is for us a huge privilege. And that's why so many other countries now want to join BRICS, and why probably in the second half of this century, BRICS is going to become as important, if not more important, than G7.
Brilliant, brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, listen, it's been wonderful from you, Clem. I've written down all 10 of the flags of the global, plus the 2 scenarios, and how many flags? We've got 5 flags for South Africa, plus the 2 scenarios. So deeply appreciated. I always love the context, because you're talking, and I did what I was told by you. I went and read all the articles on News 24, and I've read your book. But it's amazing in 1 hour how you've been able to conceptualize it and make it easy for me, and I'm sure everyone else, to understand between the flags, the probabilities, and the scenarios and the probabilities. So deeply, deeply appreciate that. What we're going to do now is we're going to be pivoting. I'm just going to do a quick summary, and we're going to pivot over to the private VIP room in terms of Q&A. I know there's been a bunch of questions that have been asked. My partner Shane has been taking all those down, and we'll go through those in the Q&A room. I just want to share my screen quickly before we pivot over, just to remind people that, if you are looking to diversify, invest overseas, we've helped over 4,000 other people do it, whether it's wealth protection, Plan B, peace of mind, diversification, passive income, freedom, global citizen, empower your children, immigration, whatever it is for you. It's about living a life unlimited. It's about the freedom in terms of that process. We've now helped people in 178 countries, over 1.3 billion in terms of investment. But it all comes down to two things, which we've been about today. It's getting the right information and the right partners. So, you know, how do you go out? Where do you find? There's lots of information on the internet. Yes, there's ChatGPT, but how do you know that you're getting the right information and the right partners? And I remind you, if you take what Clem said today, take those different scenarios, take the probabilities, and ultimately, depending on where you think the world is going, you know, this is the philosophy that you can follow. If you are interested, I always tend to joke, the only people that ever read this book were my mother. But seriously, it's 250 pages and most people don't actually go out and read anymore. But if you are interested, we've upgraded this and we've got the course, which is a 6-week course. You'll choose your top 5 countries, your top 5 currencies, your top 15 assets, how to find the right partners, how to build a wealth plan over time, and ultimately how can you use technology in terms of investing. So that is available. And if you are interested, just go to the link wealthgoingglobal.com/join. I'm not going to talk about it today. You can go watch the video of what it's all about. But in simple terms, this is learning while doing. So, you know, if you wanted to 6 to 7 weeks from now, literally have a game plan for where you're going over your next 10 years, this is what's been created. And I deeply appreciate Clem today giving us the update on the scenarios, because that actually impacts your countries and where you should be investing. And then for those of you that want to understand the tricks, you know, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. It's not the first time we've had global uncertainty in the world. What have some of the wealthiest people done in the past? You know, we've got a diversification masterclass on Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. And if you're watching the recording, just go to that link and you can find an update in terms of that process. So without further ado, I wanted to finish off with a saying by the great man, Nelson Mandela. And he said, money won't create success. The freedom to make it will. And I think from my side, I'm deeply, deeply appreciate, you know, Clem, you sharing with everyone, because what we're trying to do today is give people the freedom so that they can make their own choices. And that's what I sincerely value about everything you've shared. To everyone who's been here, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. If you are interested in joining us and coming to the private FAQ VIP room, that's for people that are part of the Wealth Going Global or our Wealth Hackers or the Mastermind. So if you're part of those groups, you will have the link. If you want to be part of it, just go to this join link and you'll be able to access it. And with that, thank you very much. Clem, I'll see you in the other room with everyone for the FAQ.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone. Bye then.